Ghosts, revenants, poltergeists, demons, visions of the afterlife. Whether these accounts of the supernatural are real or imagined is a moot point, as these beliefs are as old as human comprehension of death itself. A Google search will tell you that even today, many people still believe in all of these things. But throughout history, ghosts, visions of the dead, and troublesome or helpful entities have been depicted in art and discussed orally since even the earliest societies. Particularly in medieval Europe, ghosts came to be a very real social construct with very real cultural consequences. Widely believed and often also tied to belief in miracles, saints, and God himself, or to his opposite, the devil. So what is this historiography? The term historiography combines the Greek words for history and for writing, and we use it to discuss the historical development of historical writing. Meta, I know. That said, the Historiography of Ghosts is a surprisingly short one. In her survey on the subject, Catherine Edwards suggests that until the 1970s, when Keith Thomas published a chapter on ghosts in his seminal work, Religion and the Decline of Magic, belief in ghosts in the Middle Ages was a sorely neglected topic. But even Thomas's attention to the subject was cursory. He lumped ghosts into a chapter of only 27 pages, along with fairies. Nevertheless, his research sparked interest in academia, and Thomas's book was followed by a slew of others, many of them to be discussed during this video. They worked on everything from pagan tales to corporeal undead, the development of purgatory, saintly visions, possession by demons, as well as the more ordinary sorts of ghosts we so often hear about. Before we go further, you're probably wondering, why clump all of these disparate topics together? Why categorize them all under the same term, ghost? Purgatory and saintly visions seem more pertinent to religious studies, and the undead are more like zombies or vampires than anything else. But in his 1994 publication, Ghosts in the Middle Ages, analyst Jean-Claude Schmitt separates apparitions of so-called ordinary everyday ghosts from dreams of the afterlife, saints' visions, angels, demons, vampires, and whatever else he could think of. Many, including Claude Lecouteux, publishing only a couple years afterward, lament this division, for categorizing in such a way creates artificial distinctions the likes of which people did not consider in the medieval period, for cultural beliefs cannot always be so easily deciphered. For instance, in the chronicle The Annals of Fulda, a town in present-day Germany, there is an account of an entity in 858 that terrorized the town by setting buildings on fire. Translator Timothy Reuter uses the words evil spirit, but is this a poltergeist, a vengeful spirit, or a demon? It is not clear, but its significance is not its label. It is that it was written down and believed just as any saint's miracle would have been. Besides, especially in a period of relatively few sources, disregarding sources for being too Christian, too pagan, or not specific enough, runs the very real risk of having too few sources to study. Other terms have already been appropriated. Marx used spectre in his Communist Manifesto, and the philosopher Derrida coined hauntology in Spectres of Marx a century later, further linking the terms to ideology and not to cultural beliefs. Supernatural and paranormal draw too many modern conceptions of pseudoscience. Apparition is too immaterial, shade too obscure. The word ghosts is not perfect, but brings many of the right elements to mind, and so, the historiography of ghosts it is. If we are considering ghosts so broadly, the historiography also goes back further than Keith Thomas to E.R. Dodds, who in the 1960s was already writing about the significance of demonic and religious experiences. This is followed in the 1970s by the infamous Peter Brown's research on saints in the making of late antiquity, in which he argues that by the early Middle Ages the saint was the primary vessel for supernatural phenomena. Jean-Claude Schmitt, as previously mentioned, follows by the 1990s with an analysis that Le Couture deems too clerical, ignoring the importance of pagan representations of ghosts, which no doubt had a large influence on early medieval laypeople. These men, the first few ripples of the history of cultural beliefs, spoke to each other across continents, or rather, they did not. For although Dodds in the UK and Brown in America had a rapport, and Schmitt in France was a well-known analyst, and thus was connected to the greater academic network, Le Couture, who has published multiple different monographs on the subject in French, has only been translated and published by an obscure New Age press in America, in spite of being a renowned French medievalist in his own right. Likewise, others in Edward's survey, such as Michel Vauvel, do not even have the fortune of having been translated into English at all. But in spite of this, there has been some movement forward, and in various directions, most of which has been interdisciplinary. Yet another French historian, Jacques Le Goff, writes on the concept of space in descriptions of purgatory, and ties into geographical history trends later taken up by scholars such as Miles Ogborn. Likewise, drawing from the interdisciplinary drives of theorists like Hayden White, Philippe Arié crosses over into the realm of literature and archaeology in his book, The Hour of Our Death, examining instances of supernatural happenings in medieval literature and considering the living's relationship with the dead in terms of the positioning of cemeteries. Also pushing at the field in more recent years are female scholars. In a direct way, rewriting the history of female mystics and their morally questionable visions is Nancy Cachola in Discerning Spirits. With a women's studies agenda reminiscent of Judith Butler, hers is a welcome addition to a historiography dominated, as most are, by men. Joining her, although tackling a later historical period, is Avery Gordon, borrowing from sociology and psychology and following directly in the tracks of scholars like Michel Foucault and Desartaux. Gordon takes a postmodernist approach to cultural belief in ghosts, claiming that haunting is one way in which abusive systems of power make themselves known and their impacts felt in everyday life. These are but a few of the scholars of this burgeoning but fragmented field of study. And unfortunately, the historiography of ghosts remains as disparate as the sources it draws from. But these gaps can be filled, and its versatility may one day prove to be its strength. With so many scholars going in so many different directions, I leave you with one last approach. Andrew Joines, in Medieval Ghost Stories, puts all else aside and after a brief introduction provides excerpts from clerical, literary, and pagan sources, leaving the reader to decipher them on their own. Perhaps, sometimes, less is more. So just what exactly makes the study of ghosts of any interest to us? Throughout the ages, they have served many purposes. Today, we use ghosts to scare ourselves. We use them to poke fun. We use them to conceptualize death and to understand and to cope. Is it any wonder such beliefs persist to this day? In the medieval period, this too was true. Ghosts were never the norm. They were, and still are, the product of some disturbance in the natural order of things. A ghost story provides the living with either hope of things to come or a warning of how best to proceed in the land of the living. It should come as no surprise that in times of trouble ghost stories seem to crop up to offer these consolations and explanations. The historiography of ghosts in the Middle Ages may be of a period long past, but in many ways it is still fascinating in that it is familiar. As Keith Thomas said in his preface, so many decades ago, these things were taken seriously by intelligent persons in the past, and it is the historian's business to explain why this was so. Or, as newer, perhaps less empirically minded people beg to differ, we have developed a highly aggressive scientific system which seeks to eliminate rivals, and we must break free of this intellectual constraint and allow ourselves to see the living and the dead through differently focused eyes.